In front of hundreds of powerful guests, a millionaire raised his finger, accusing the maid who had served his family for years. Everyone thought it was the end for her, the moment her life would collapse in shame. But then his little daughter stepped forward, and what she said left the entire mansion in shock. Stay with us until the very end, you won't believe the twist. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unbelievable stories. The Hale Mansion stood like a fortress of wealth on the edge of Manhattan's Upper East Side, its tall windows glowing against the December night. Cars lined the driveway, sleek black sedans and limousines, dropping off men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. Inside, the grand ballroom was alive with music from a live jazz quartet, and chandeliers cast golden rain across marble floors. It was the night of the annual Winter Charity Gala, a tradition Richard Hale had kept for nearly a decade. The guest list read like the pages of Forbes: senators, CEOs, media moguls, and socialites. Waiters glided between guests carrying trays of French champagne, and the air was thick with perfume, expensive cologne, and conversations about stocks, politics, and philanthropy. In the midst of this glittering world, Elena Martinez moved quietly, almost like a shadow. Dressed in her simple navy uniform with a crisp white apron, she blended into the corners of the grand room. For 5 years, she had served the Hale family, dusting priceless art, polishing silver, and making sure every gala, every dinner, every event went perfectly. She was diligent, respectful, and invisible, yet tonight, her invisibility was shattered by the weight of her own exhaustion. Her hands ached from hours of setting tables, aligning crystal glasses, and arranging flowers that cost more than her monthly rent. She thought of her 13-year-old son, Daniel, back home with her elderly mother. She'd promised she'd bring him leftover dessert from the gala, his favorite chocolate tarts, but even that small joy seemed far away in this cold, glittering room. Across the room, the host of the night, Richard Hale, stood tall, his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, his tailored tuxedo fitting like a second skin. He was the picture of American success, a man who had risen from a modest background to become a billionaire investor. At 50 years old, he carried himself with the commanding presence of someone used to being obeyed. But Richard wasn't the only Hale who captured attention that night. At the base of the grand staircase stood Lila Hale, his 9-year-old daughter. Lila wore a velvet crimson dress with a satin ribbon at the waist. Her blonde hair fell in soft curls, and her bright grey eyes didn't wander like other children's might. Instead, she watched. She noticed. She understood more than she should for her age. From her spot, Lila saw Elena quietly adjusting glasses at one of the long banquet tables. She noticed the lines of fatigue on Elena's face, the tremor in her hand when she set down the crystal goblet. Lila had always liked Elena more than most of the adults in her house. Elena listened. Elena cared. When Richard was busy and the rest of the household staff treated her like porcelain, Elena had sat with her, told her bedtime stories in Spanish, and even braided her hair when no one else bothered. The orchestra played softer now as the meal was about to begin. Waiters dimmed the lights slightly. Guests gathered around the main dining table, their laughter growing louder, their voices bouncing off marble walls. Then Richard lifted his champagne glass and tapped it with a spoon. The sound cut through the music and laughter like a blade. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Richard Hale, their host. He stood tall at the head of the long banquet table, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling, "before we proceed with our dinner, I must address something of great importance, something that threatens the very trust of this household." The room shifted. Some guests leaned forward with curiosity, others glanced at one another with raised brows. Elena, standing near the dessert table, froze. The tone in Richard's voice made her chest tighten. It was sharp, accusatory. A nervous sweat began to bead on her brow. She had no reason to fear. She had done nothing wrong, but something about the way he said trust felt like a shadow crawling across her skin. Richard set down his glass and looked around the room. This morning, he continued, his voice tightening, we discovered that an item of irreplaceable value is missing. A family heirloom that belonged to my late wife. The words struck the guests like a shockwave. Murmurs rippled across the ballroom. Elena's heart raced. She knew exactly what piece he was referring to. The antique ivory figurine that had always sat on a desk in his private study. She admired it every time she dusted, never daring to touch. Richard's gaze swept across the room like a searchlight. The investigation narrowed down who had access to my study yesterday afternoon. Only one person fits that description. Elena's knees weakened. Her throat went dry. She wanted to disappear into the floor. But the moment of accusation was already here. Richard's eyes locked on her like a predator finding its prey. His voice cut through the silence like a knife. Elena Martinez. The entire ballroom turned to her. Her tray slipped in her trembling hands. Glasses clinked dangerously. The silence was deafening. Dozens of wealthy, powerful eyes staring at her, cutting her down without a word. Elena's breath hitched in her throat as the sound of her own name echoed through the cavernous ballroom. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it, if perhaps Richard had meant someone else. But no, every head had turned in her direction. The senator's wife in her emerald gown tilted her chin in disgust. The banker with his champagne glass smirked knowingly, and the matriarch seated closest to Richard whispered something to the woman beside her with a sharp glance toward Eleanor. Her legs trembled as though they might give way beneath her. She gripped the silver tray tighter, the polished metal cold against her damp palms. It was as if time slowed, the murmurs of the guests, the faint notes of jazz fading into silence. The golden glow of the chandelier suddenly feeling harsh and unkind. Richard's voice was steady, commanding, almost rehearsed. For 5 years we have trusted you, given you access to every room in this house. And yet the evidence is undeniable. Yesterday morning the figurine sat in my study. By evening it was gone. And you, Elena, were the only one who entered. Gasps rippled through the guests, followed by a cruel wave of whispers. Always said you can't trust the help. She had the perfect opportunity. How shameless in a house that fed her. Each word was like a dagger, stabbing deeper into Elena's chest. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, with a voice that shook but carried desperation, she stammered, "Mr. Hale, please, I didn't take anything. I would never—" "Enough!" Richard's voice boomed, making several guests flinch. "Do not insult my intelligence with lies." The tray in her hands rattled. One glass tipped and fell, shattering on the marble floor. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the silence, and a few women gasped, drawing back as though Elena were contagious. She dropped to her knees instinctively, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the shards, her vision blurred with tears. Not from the glass that had nicked her palm, but from the humiliation burning hotter than fire. Her blood smeared faintly on the floor as she tried to clean it, the whispers around her swelling louder. From the top of the staircase, Lila watched, her little hands gripping the polished banister so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her grey eyes widened at the cruelty unfolding below. She had seen her father stern before, seen him silence business rivals with a glance, dismiss employees with a wave of his hand. But she had never seen him crush someone like this. And especially not Eleanor. Richard raised a hand. "Stand up," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for defiance. Elena rose slowly, her knees weak, her cut hand trembling at her side. She felt like a criminal standing trial, with no jury but the hostile eyes of strangers. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can search me. You can search my home. You'll find nothing. I swear on my son," her words faltered. Mentioning Daniel in this gilded hall felt like dragging his innocence into the fire. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, but she forced herself to continue. "I've done nothing but serve this family with honesty." Richard's expression hardened. "You dare use your child as a shield for your dishonesty. Shameful," the crowd buzzed again. "Shameful," someone echoed. "Disgraceful." "Throw her out!" Eleanor's heart pounded in her ears. Her world tilted, and she felt like she might faint. She thought of Daniel's smile, his faith in her, his trust that she worked hard for him. She thought of her mother's weary face when she left for her shifts, promising she'd come home safe. How could she face them after this? The humiliation pressed down on her like a weight, every second stretched into eternity. She wanted to run, to hide, to vanish. But her feet were rooted to the floor. Then suddenly another sound cut through the room. A clear, high voice. Small, but sharp enough to pierce the tension like lightning. "Stop!" The word bounced against the marble, carried to every corner of the ballroom. Every head turned, shocked, not toward Elena this time, but to the staircase. There stood Lila, her little crimson dress glowing against the golden light. She descended the stairs quickly, her shoes tapping against the steps, her ribbon bouncing with each determined stride. Her young face was pale but resolute, her eyes glistening with something that was neither fear nor hesitation. She crossed the ballroom like a storm breaking loose, ignoring the startled looks of senators and CEOs, ignoring her grandmother's gasp of disapproval. She marched straight to Eleanor's side and took the woman's trembling hand in hers. The size difference was stark, the delicate fingers of a child entwined with the scarred, work-worn hand of a housekeeper. Gasps filled the room. Murmurs rose again. "Lila!" Richard's voice thundered. "Go back upstairs. This does not concern you." But his daughter did not flinch. She lifted her chin, her small hand gripping Elena's tighter. Her voice rang out, soft yet unyielding. "It does concern me, Daddy, because you're hurting someone who never hurt us." The room fell silent. Even the orchestra, unsure what to do, lowered their instruments. Elena's tears spilled freely now, but for the first time that evening, they weren't from humiliation. They were from shock, from gratitude, from the fierce, unexpected shield of a child who had nothing to gain by defending her. Richard's eyes burned with anger and disbelief. His daughter, his only child, was defying him in front of 50 of the most powerful people in New York. And yet, in that fragile, defiant voice, there was something no one in the room could deny. The unmistakable ring of truth. The air inside the ballroom had turned heavy, as if the glittering chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, eager to see what would unfold. Some were clearly scandalized that a child had spoken up in such a setting. Others intrigued. And a few, those who still remembered what compassion looked like, watched with a softness in their eyes. Richard's jaw tightened, the muscles along his temple twitching. He had spent his life building an image of control, of dominance, of unquestionable authority. He had silenced boardrooms with a single look, reduced competitors to rubble with a single remark. But here, in his own ballroom, in the middle of his own carefully orchestrated gala, his 9-year-old daughter had just torn a hole through his composure. "Lila," his voice carried like a whip, "low but dangerous. This is not your place. Return to your room immediately." The child didn't move. Her small frame looked almost fragile beside Elena's, but the way she held herself, the way her chin lifted, her eyes locked onto her father's, made her seem taller than anyone in the room. She squeezed Elena's trembling hand tighter, as though to borrow her strength and give it back to her. Her words came slowly, but clearly, each one deliberate. "It is my place, Daddy, because she's my family too." The murmurs that rippled through the crowd were almost physical, like a wave rolling through the ballroom. People turned their heads, eyebrows raised, lips parted. The word family echoed, strange and powerful, reshaping the narrative in an instant. Richard felt his stomach twist, but he forced his face to remain stern. "Family?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. "She is an employee. She cleans floors and polishes silver. That is not family, Lila." The little girl shook her head fiercely, her blonde curls bouncing. "No, she reads to me when you're gone. She holds my hand when I have nightmares. She knows my favorite story, my favorite color, my favorite candy. She listens when no one else does. She's family to me, even if you can't see it." Gasps filled the room again. A woman at the far table pressed a hand to her chest. A man muttered something about "out of the mouths of babes." Elena's tears streamed freely now, but she tried to tug her hand away from Lila's, whispering through trembling lips, "Sweetheart, don't do this." You'll only make things worse." But Lila held on tighter. "No," she said firmly, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "The truth can't make things worse." Richard's face flushed, both with anger and something else, something he refused to name. Shame. "Lila," he growled, "you are speaking of matters you don't understand. The figurine is gone. The facts are clear. Elena was the only one who had access." The child's grey eyes flashed. "You don't know the facts. You didn't even ask her. You didn't even look." The words stung because they were true. Richard hadn't asked, hadn't investigated beyond a hasty conclusion. He had acted out of impulse, fueled by whispers from his mother, from advisors who insisted appearances mattered more than truth. One of the guests, an older man with a cane, cleared his throat loudly. "Richard, perhaps the child has a point. Maybe it's worth hearing the woman out." Richard shot him a look that silenced him instantly, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Around the room, other guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. For the first time that evening, the tide of silent judgment wasn't entirely against Elena. Elena, however, felt her heart breaking even more. She didn't want this little girl, this child who had already lost her mother, who carried loneliness in her eyes, to stand between her and the wrath of a powerful man. "Please," she whispered, crouching slightly, so her words were meant for Lila alone, though the hush in the room carried them to every ear. "Please, darling, don't risk your father's anger for me. I can leave. I'll be fine." But Lila shook her head so hard it made the ribbon in her hair slip loose. "No, you won't be fine. You'll cry. Daniel will cry. And I'll cry too. Because losing you would break us." At the mention of Daniel, Elena gasped. She had spoken of her son to Lila in quiet moments, never thinking the child would remember, let alone use his name now, here, in front of New York's elite. Lila turned back to her father, her voice steadier now, fueled by both innocence and fury. "Do you know about Daniel, Daddy? Do you know he waits for her every night? Do you know she works 2 jobs so she can pay for her mother's medicine? Do you know she gives money to church even when she has nothing left for herself? You don't know any of that because you never asked." A sharp silence filled the air. Elena covered her mouth, sobs escaping despite her effort to contain them. How could this child, this little girl, remember so much? How could she strip bare the dignity Elena had tried so hard to hide, and yet make it sound like honor instead of shame? Richard's lips parted, but no words came. He felt every pair of eyes in the room on him, not with admiration as usual, but with scrutiny, even disdain. The empire he built on fear and power seemed to wobble under the weight of his daughter's truth. Then Lila delivered the blow that cracked the foundation. Her small voice, trembling but determined, carried across the hall. "Yesterday I saw her put the figurine back on your desk. I was hiding in the curtains, playing. It had fallen. She didn't steal it. She saved it." The words landed like a thunderclap. Guests gasped audibly, several whispering in shock. Elena's head snapped toward Lila, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't even known the girl was there in the study yesterday. Richard froze. He remembered vaguely noticing the figurine had been slightly moved, but he had brushed it aside as his own carelessness. Now faced with his daughter's unwavering gaze, he felt the floor shift beneath him. "You accuse her of stealing," Lila continued, her voice breaking with emotion, "but she prayed over that figurine. I heard her. She kissed her fingers and touched it and said, 'May God protect the memory of Mrs. Hale.' You accused someone who was protecting your memory of Mom." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's throat tightened. The mention of his late wife, Emily, hit him like a blade twisting in his chest. He hadn't expected to hear her name tonight. He hadn't expected his daughter to summon her memory with such force. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and champagne, now felt like a courtroom. And Richard was the one on trial Elena couldn't stand anymore. She fell to her knees again, sobbing openly, overwhelmed by the turn of events. She wanted to disappear, yet the small hand in hers kept her anchored. Lila bent down, wrapping her arms around Elena's neck, whispering, "I won't let them hurt you. Not while I'm here. Guests shifted in their chairs, their expressions changing. The smugness had faded, replaced with guilt, pity, even admiration. Whispers grew into conversations. Some nodded toward Richard with disapproval. Others dabbed at their eyes with linen napkins. For the first time in years, Richard Hale, the man known for never backing down, never faltering, felt the weight of being utterly, irreversibly wrong, and as he looked at his daughter, standing guard over a woman everyone else had condemned, he realized the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't scandal or gossip. It was the truth spoken through the mouth of a child. The silence inside the ballroom stretched unbearably long. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt like 1,000 eyes staring, 1,000 judgments hanging in the air. The clinking of crystal and the smooth jazz that had filled the space only moments ago seemed like echoes from a different universe. Now there was only stillness, and at the center of it all stood Richard Hale, his little daughter, and a housekeeper whose world had just been turned upside down. Richard's lips parted as though he might speak, but no sound came. For the first time in his life, he looked uncertain, his chest rising and falling, his hand trembling slightly on the stem of his champagne glass. All his power, all his reputation, all his dominance in boardrooms and high society, it meant nothing in this moment, not against the clear, unwavering truth of a child's voice. The guests shifted, restless, their whispers rising again. "Did you hear what she said? She saw it with her own eyes." God, imagine accusing her after that. Even those who had earlier sneered at Elena were now reconsidering, their faces betraying doubt. A few women dabbed their eyes discreetly, touched by Lila's courage. Others looked at Richard with something colder, disappointment, even contempt. Elena knelt on the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She had never cried like this in front of anyone, not even her son. She had always been strong, always held her pain inside. But now her strength was undone, not by shame, but by the overwhelming wave of this little girl's loyalty. Her tears weren't only for herself. They were for Lila too, for the innocence of a child forced to fight a battle that adults had chosen to ignore. Richard's mother, Margaret Hale, sat rigidly at the far end of the table. Her silver hair gleamed under the chandelier, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been the first to whisper earlier, the first to sow the seed of suspicion. She had always believed in keeping the help at arm's length. But now even she could not ignore the way the room had turned. The matriarch's eyes flicked from Elena to her son, then to her granddaughter. A strange mix of calculation and something softer flickering across her features. Richard finally lowered his glass, setting it heavily onto the polished table. The sound was sharp, final. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "Lila," he said, his voice lower now, almost strained, "you think you understand, but you don't. This is not about bedtime stories or braiding your hair. This is about trust, about reputation. Do you understand what it means if I am wrong? Do you understand what it does to this family if we are seen as weak?" The child's eyes glistened, but her voice didn't waver. "Being fair isn't weak, Daddy. Being cruel is weak. Mummy used to tell me that." Her words cut deeper than any accusation. Richard flinched, his jaw tightening. The mention of his late wife was like a blade twisting in his chest. Emily had been the one person who kept his hardness in check, the one who reminded him that success wasn't everything. Losing her had turned him colder, harder, and more obsessed with control. And now, in front of everyone, his daughter was invoking her mother's memory against him. One of the senators seated near the front leaned toward another guest and whispered, "Not quietly enough. The kid's braver than half the people in this room." Another chimed in, "Richard's daughter just saved that woman's life." Richard heard them. His ears burned. His pride screamed at him to silence Lila, to end this spectacle before it destroyed the last shreds of his authority. But another voice, the one he had buried since Emily's death, began to whisper in the back of his mind. Elena tried once more to intervene. She pulled her hand gently, whispering through tears, "Lila, please, enough. I can't let you risk this for me. If I go, I'll survive. I always have." But Lila only clung tighter, shaking her head. Her voice cracked as she cried out, "No! You won't survive the same. You'll break. And then I'll break too. I love you." The words hung in the air, pure and devastating. For a child to say that to her housekeeper in front of senators, CEOs, and society's elite, it was unthinkable. The whispers turned to gasps. A woman at the far end actually covered her mouth with her hand. Richard's knees weakened. He gripped the edge of the table, his eyes darting between his daughter and Elena. He saw the way Elena looked at the girl, not as a servant, but as someone who truly loved her, who carried her burdens when no one else noticed. He saw the desperation in Lila's face, the tears streaming freely, the fierce courage that made her look so much like Emily in that moment. And then he saw something else. The guests. Their expressions were no longer deferential. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with judgment. He realized that no matter what he did next, the story of this night would spread through Manhattan by morning. But whether he would be remembered as a tyrant or as a man willing to admit his error, that decision still rested in his hands. The silence cracked when Lila's voice rang out again, trembling but firm. "If you make her leave tonight, Daddy, then I'll go too. I won't stay in this house without her." The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Richard's eyes widened. "Lila, don't say things you don't mean." "I mean it," she said, her little voice shaking but clear. "Because family isn't just blood. Family is who holds you when you cry. Family is who stays when everyone else leaves. And if you send her away, you're sending away part of my family." The words were a hammer blow. A collective murmur rose among the guests, some openly nodding, others whispering. "She's right." The weight of the moment was undeniable. Richard staggered back a step, his polished shoes squeaking faintly on the marble. He pressed a hand to his face, trying to hide the storm raging inside him. For the first time, the titan of industry looked small, human, cornered not by rivals or scandals, but by the piercing honesty of his daughter. And at the center of it all, Elena remained frozen, clutching Lila's hand like a lifeline. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even breathe. She had no idea how this night would end, but for the first time, she dared to believe that the truth might actually save her. The chandelier light shimmered over the room like judgment itself, and the entire elite of New York waited, breathless, to see what Richard Hale would do next. Richard Hale had faced hostile shareholders, ruthless competitors, and cutthroat media interrogations, but never in his 50 years had he felt so utterly exposed. The eyes of New York's elite pierced him like 100 arrows. He could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on his shoulders, each one demanding an answer, each one silently asking, what kind of man humiliates a loyal servant and ignores the voice of his own child? His pulse throbbed in his temples. He gripped the edge of the banquet table so tightly, his knuckles whitened. His pride screamed at him to stand firm, to declare his decision final, to protect the reputation he had built brick by brick through intimidation and power. But another force, quieter yet stronger, surged from within, the voice of Emily. His late wife, he could almost hear her, soft, patient, endlessly compassionate, reminding him that wealth meant nothing without humanity. "Remember, Richard," she had often told him, "the way you treat those who have the least says more about you than the way you treat those who have the most." Lila's tear-streaked face mirrored Emily's spirit so vividly that Richard's chest ached. He had tried to raise his daughter in a fortress of privilege, but here she was, tearing down the very walls he had built, reminding him that truth and love could not be silenced by marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The ballroom had become a theater, every guest and audience member waiting for the climax. Whispers rippled like waves across the room. "This is unbelievable. The child is braver than any of us. Richard Hale has lost control of his own house." Margaret Hale, Richard's mother, broke her silence at last. Her voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the murmurs. "Enough of this nonsense. Richard, you cannot allow a child to dictate your authority. If you do not remove that woman immediately, you will shame this family in front of every person here." Her words seemed to restore some of Richard's armor. He straightened, his face hardening. He turned toward Elena, who still knelt on the marble floor, clutching his daughter's small hand. Elena's face was blotched from crying, her eyes swollen, her cut palm leaving faint smears of red against the polished surface. Yet there was dignity in her posture, an unbroken core of strength. Richard opened his mouth, ready to deliver the words that would end it all. When Lila spoke again, "You always say," she cried, her voice cracking but steady, "that a Hale keeps their word. That honesty is everything. But you didn't even give her a chance to speak. You didn't even look for the truth. You only wanted someone to blame," Richard faltered. His daughter's words hit him like a slap. He saw the guests nodding in agreement, some whispering, "She's right." For the first time, Richard realized his authority wasn't just challenged. It was crumbling, and then came the moment that shattered him completely. Leela turned her tearful gaze toward the crowd and declared, "If my daddy makes her leave, then I'll leave too, and I won't come back." The collective gasp was deafening. Glasses clinked as hands trembled. One woman actually dropped her napkin, clutching at her pearls. The idea of the Hale heir walking away from her mansion, her fortune, her life of luxury, for a housekeeper, was unthinkable. Richard's heart lurched. "Lila, don't say such things. You don't understand what you're saying." But the child stamped her little foot on the marble, her voice rising, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I do understand. I understand that family means love, not money. I understand that Elena is the only one who listens to me when I cry about Mommy. I understand that she held me when I was sick and you were in California. I understand that she's the one who tells me bedtime stories when everyone else is too busy. If you make her leave, then you're taking away the only family I have left." Richard's vision blurred for a moment, his throat tightening. He hadn't known. He hadn't realized how deep Elena's role had become in his daughter's life. He thought providing tutors, clothes, and vacations would fill the hole Emily left behind. But it hadn't. Elena had. The guests murmured louder now, their voices a chorus of judgment. "She's right. She's only 9, and she sees clearer than any of us. Richard Hale should be ashamed." Elena, overwhelmed, finally found her voice. She looked up at Richard, her voice trembling but clear. "Sir, I never asked to be anything but your employee. I never asked to be in this position. But your daughter is right. I did find the figurine. I placed it back on your desk carefully because it belonged to your wife. I prayed over it. I would never steal from you, not ever. I have my dignity, even if I don't have riches." The words struck him harder than any insult could have. Dignity. In all his pursuit of wealth, of legacy, of dominance, he had forgotten what that word meant. For a long moment, Richard stood there, the silence heavier than before. Every breath, every heartbeat, every glance in that ballroom hung on what he would do next. He looked at his daughter, trembling but defiant, clutching Elena's hand as if her life depended on it. He looked at Elena, broken but proud, a woman who had endured years of invisibility only to be accused in the cruelest of ways. And finally he looked at his guests, some glaring, some softened, all waiting, and Richard Hale, the man who had always believed he could bend the world to his will, realized that in this moment he had no power left but one, the power to admit he was wrong. He opened his mouth, his voice hoarse but audible. But before he could continue, the heavy double doors of the ballroom creaked open. All heads turned. A tall man in a security uniform stepped inside, holding something small in his gloved hands. His eyes scanned the room nervously before locking on Richard. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying, "we've just found this." It was hidden in the coat of one of the catering staff. The ivory figurine! The room erupted in gasps and murmurs, louder than ever. Elena's body sagged as though her soul might leave her. She clutched her chest, relief flooding through her in hot, uncontrollable sobs. Layla squeezed her hand, whispering, "See? I told you." Richard froze. His mind spun, his pride collapsing entirely. He had been wrong, catastrophically, publicly wrong, and the evidence now stood against him for all to see. The crowd didn't wait for him to speak. They began whispering again, their voices carrying judgment, awe, and even pity, and for Richard Hale, the night was no longer about wealth or power. It was about redemption or ruin. The ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis as the security guard's words sank in. The ivory figurine, Emily's cherished heirloom, the object that had turned the night into a crucifixion for Elena, had been found, and not in her possession. Not in her home, not anywhere near her, but stuffed carelessly into the coat of a catering worker who now sat trembling in the staff quarters under watchful eyes. The guard placed the figurine on a velvet cloth atop the banquet table. The chandelier's light struck its smooth surface, making it gleam like an object of divine judgment. All eyes in the room shifted from the figurine to Richard, then to Elena, and back to Richard again. Elena staggered as though her knees might give way. She clasped her hands to her chest, sobs racking her body. Relief, humiliation, vindication, it all crashed together at once. Her reputation, her dignity, her very survival had been torn apart in front of this crowd. And now the truth sat there, silent and gleaming, exposing the injustice she had endured. Lila wrapped both arms around her waist, pressing her little cheek against Elena's side. "I told you, Tia Elena, I told you," she whispered, her voice full of fierce triumph and childlike love. Elena stroked the girl's hair with trembling fingers, unable to stop the tears flowing down her cheeks. The guests' murmurs swelled like a storm. She was innocent all along. What a disgrace. How could he accuse her without proof? Richard Hale, undone by his own pride. The senator's wife, who had earlier sneered, now looked away with shame. The banker, who had muttered cruelly, suddenly busied himself with his napkin. The matriarch, Margaret Hale, sat stiff-backed, her lips pursed so tightly they turned pale. For once, even she had no words. Richard's face burned crimson. He felt the ground open beneath him. He, the man who commanded boardrooms and governments, who prided himself on never faltering, now stood exposed as arrogant, rash, and unjust. His chest rose and fell heavily, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. For a fleeting moment, he considered salvaging what pride he could. He could claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he had acted on the information he had. He could blame the staff, the security team, even his own mother's whispers. But as his eyes met his daughter's, those grey eyes glistening with both triumph and pain, he realized there was no salvaging this with half-truths. The only path left was the one he had always despised. Humility. Richard took a deep breath, stepped forward, and raised his voice so it carried across the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen." The murmurs softened, the room falling still again. Every head turned. "I was wrong." The words, simple yet monumental, echoed through the ballroom like thunder. Some guests gasped outright, others leaned forward in astonishment. Richard Hale, man of iron will, master of markets, untouchable titan, had admitted fault. He turned toward Elena, who was still kneeling, tears streaking her face. His voice trembled for the first time anyone could remember. "Elena Martinez, I accused you unjustly. I stripped you of your dignity, humiliated you in front of those who should have respected you, and I ignored your years of loyalty. I let my pride and fear cloud my judgment. And for that, I beg your forgiveness." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Margaret Hale's lips parted as if to object, but she stopped herself, stunned into silence. Elena's mouth opened, but no words came. Her entire body shook. She had dreamt of this moment in her darkest hours. Not an apology, never that, but simply the chance to be seen, to be believed. Now, hearing the words from the very man who had condemned her, her voice caught in her throat. Richard wasn't finished. He turned back to the guests, his shoulders squared, though his eyes revealed the storm inside. "To all of you gathered here tonight, you saw me condemn an innocent woman. You saw me act in arrogance, choosing to protect my reputation instead of seeking the truth. If my daughter had not spoken, if a child had not reminded me of what real honor looks like, I would have destroyed an innocent life. For that, I ask not only Elena's forgiveness, but yours as well." The room was silent, heavy with the weight of his words. Then, In a gesture that shocked them even more, Richard turned back to Elena. Slowly, deliberately, he sank to his knees before her. The sight was unthinkable. Richard Hale, billionaire, master of the city, kneeling before a housekeeper. Gasps filled the air. A few women raised trembling hands to their mouths. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some averting their eyes. It was a reversal of power so profound that no one knew how to respond. Lena's sobs broke louder. "Please, sir, don't—" But Richard shook his head. His voice cracked as he said, "For 5 years you cleaned this home on your knees. Tonight I kneel before your dignity." The room erupted into murmurs, half in awe, half in discomfort. Some clapped softly, others whispered furiously, but all were moved. And then another voice cut through the air, Margaret Hale's, cold, sharp, unforgiving. "This is madness. Richard, get up. You are making a spectacle of yourself. This family cannot survive if you debase yourself like this. Apologize in private if you must, but not like this." Richard turned, his eyes burning with a fire no one had seen in years. "No, Mother, not this time. If I humiliated her in public, then I will honor her in public. If my daughter can teach me courage, then I will not cower behind appearances any longer." The crowd gasped again, this time with approval. Some even clapped louder, voices murmuring words like "bravo" and "finally." Margaret sank back in her chair, her face pale with fury and disbelief. Richard rose slowly, turned to Eleanor once more and extended his hand. His voice softened, stripped of pride, filled with something human. "Elena, will you forgive me? And will you allow me to prove that this home can be yours, as much as it is mine?" Elena's tears glistened under the light. She hesitated, her hand trembling as it reached for his. When their hands met, a wave of murmurs and applause spread through the ballroom. Lila threw her arms around both of them, her little body shaking with relief and joy. And in that moment, for the first time in years, the Hale mansion wasn't filled with the empty glitter of wealth. It was filled with something richer, truth, humility, and the fragile beginning of redemption. But in the far corner of the room, a pair of eyes watched with quiet fury. Someone else, hidden in the shadows, was not pleased with this turn of events, and their presence promised that this night was only the beginning of a deeper conflict yet to come. The applause that followed Richard's public apology rippled across the marble hall, like a wave crashing against stone. Some clapped with genuine admiration, others hesitated, unsure whether to align themselves with humility or with the old order of power and appearances. Yet one thing was undeniable. The moment had shifted the very air of the Hale mansion. Elena still stood frozen, Richard's hand in hers, Lila pressed tightly against her waist. For years she had been invisible, a shadow that swept the dust from beneath the crystal chandeliers, someone whose name the guests rarely remembered. And now she was the centerpiece of the grandest ballroom in Manhattan, the center of every gaze. Richard's hand was warm, trembling slightly, as if he too could not believe what he had just done. His voice had been stripped bare in front of the same people who had once praised him for strength and cunning. Tonight they had seen something different, vulnerability. But not all were pleased. From the far edge of the ballroom, near the arched double doors, Andrew Hale, Richard's elder brother and longtime business partner, narrowed his eyes. His jaw clenched, his champagne flute tilting slightly in his grip. Unlike Richard, Andrew had always favored control, appearances, and the old traditions instilled by their mother, Margaret. To him, Richard's gesture tonight wasn't redemption, it was weakness. A crack in the armor that could destroy the empire they had built. "Unbelievable," Andrew muttered under his breath, his lips curling. Kneeling to a maid, "He's going to ruin us." Beside him, a young executive from one of their firms whispered nervously, "Mr. Hale, the guests are responding well. Perhaps this will—" "Silence," Andrew cut him off, his voice like ice. "They applaud because they're entertained. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, the headlines will turn this into ridicule." His eyes lingered on Eleanor and Lila, their hands intertwined with Richard's. Something twisted inside him, not guilt, not compassion, but envy. That maid, he thought, that insignificant woman, had managed to shift the course of Richard's destiny in a single night. And the child. The child had more sway over Richard than any board member, any advisor, even himself. He felt the beginnings of a plan forming in the shadows of his mind. Meanwhile, Richard guided Elena gently toward a chair at the long banquet table. Guests parted like a tide to make room for her, though some faces were tight with disapproval. Margaret Hale, the matriarch, sat stiff as a statue, her cane clenched tightly in her hand. Richard paused before her, his eyes meeting hers. "Mother!" he said firmly. "You taught me to protect this family's honor. Tonight, honor demanded that I admit my failure. I will not hide it." Margaret's eyes, steel-gray and unforgiving, bored into him. "You've humiliated us, Richard. You've lowered this family before the eyes of New York's elite. Do you think they'll forget?" Richard leaned closer, his voice low but resolute. "If they cannot respect us for truth and humility, then let them choke on their own pride. I will not raise my daughter in a house where injustice is tolerated." Margaret flinched, just barely, at the mention of Lila. Her lips pressed tight again, but she said nothing. For the first time in years, Richard had spoken words she could not dismiss with tradition or authority. Elena, still trembling, lowered herself into the chair he offered. She could feel the stares burning her from every side, admiration, pity, resentment, but she kept her chin up, her hands folded in her lap. Lila climbed into the chair beside her, holding her hand firmly. Richard straightened, his voice rising once more to address the hall. "Tonight was meant to be a night of charity. Let it still be that, but let it also be a night of truth. If my daughter had not spoken, I would have condemned an innocent woman. That will never happen in this house again." The room buzzed with whispers. Some nodded approvingly, others shook their heads. But the gala slowly resumed, waiters tentatively serving the first course, the jazz band returning to softer notes. Yet beneath the surface, nothing was the same. At the far end of the room, Andrew slipped away silently, his footsteps muffled on the marble floor. He moved into the darkened hallway, away from the golden glow of the ballroom, his phone already in hand. "This is Andrew Hale," he said into the receiver, his voice clipped. "We need to meet. Tonight." There was a pause, then a voice crackled through, low and cautious. "Now, after the gala?" "Yes, something has changed. My brother has lost his mind, and if I don't act quickly, everything we've built will collapse under his weakness." He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His reflection glared back at him from the polished glass of a framed painting. He saw a man overshadowed by his brother, a man who had worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much, but never commanded the same respect. And tonight, Richard had traded decades of authority for the favor of a maid and the words of a child. Andrew's voice was a whisper only he could hear. "If he wants to tear down this empire with sentiment, then I'll stop him. By any means." Back in the ballroom, Lila leaned her head against Elena's shoulder, her small voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "I'm glad you didn't leave me, Tia Elena." Elena kissed the top of her golden curls. "I'll never leave you, querida. Not as long as you want me here." Richard watched them, his heart heavy but stirred with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe his daughter would grow up knowing love instead of distance. Hope that perhaps he could rebuild not just his business, but his soul. But deep within the walls of the Hale mansion, shadows stirred. Plans were forming, and the greatest battle for truth and family was yet to come. The city outside the Hale mansion sparkled with winter frost. Yellow cabs sliding past snow-lined curbs, skyscrapers lit like lanterns in the December night. But inside, beneath the mansion's chandeliers and marble arches, the air carried something darker than the glitter of wealth, an unease that no amount of champagne could dissolve. Richard had returned to his guests after his public apology, but his heart wasn't with them anymore. He smiled faintly, shook hands, offered polite words, yet every glance he cast toward Elena and Lila betrayed where his true attention lay. Elena sat quietly at the end of the banquet table, her hands folded, shoulders straight, her dignity restored but fragile. Leela nestled close to her, eating a slice of cake with childlike innocence, as though the storm of humiliation and redemption had not just passed. Richard thought, I nearly destroyed this woman. I nearly betrayed my daughter's faith. And all because I let fear rule me. Yet while Richard's thoughts turned inward, Andrew Hale's turned outward, toward power, revenge, and preservation of the empire he believed belonged to him as much as his brother. After slipping from the ballroom, Andrew drove through the snow-dusted streets to a private club on Madison Avenue, a place so exclusive that even billionaires whispered to gain entry. Behind velvet curtains and mahogany doors, the true engines of New York's wealth met. Men and women whose names were seldom known to the public, yet whose decisions could topple markets and shape elections. Andrew entered a smoke-scented lounge where two figures waited. Victor Lang, a ruthless hedge fund manager with eyes like polished steel, and Senator Malcolm Reed, a long-time political ally of the Hales, who owed his campaign coffers to their fortune. You look troubled, Victor said, sipping a glass of bourbon. His tone was mocking, his smile razor-thin. Andrew loosened his scarf, his face flushed with anger. Troubled. My brother just humiliated this family in front of half the city's elite. He knelt before a maid, for God's sake. Do you have any idea what the press will do with that image? Senator Reed frowned. The people may actually love it. A billionaire showing humility? It's good optics, Andrew. Andrew slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses. Optics for him, but what about us? Investors don't want humility. They want strength, dominance, certainty. My brother is throwing away decades of power because a child scolded him. Victor leaned back, studying Andrew with a predator's patience. And what exactly do you propose? Remove Richard. Take over yourself? Andrew's jaw tightened. If he continues down this path, the empire will crumble. He's already talking about opening creches for employees' children, raising wages, giving workers more rights. Do you realize what that means? It means weakness. It means costs. It means bleeding profit for sentiment. Reed rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And you believe you can correct the course? Andrew's voice dropped to a whisper, venom curling in every word. I will. I built this empire with him, and I won't watch him throw it into the fire for a maid's tears and a little girl's ideals. Victor's smile sharpened. Careful, Andrew. Empires fall quickly, but so do brothers. Andrew's eyes burned. Then let him fall first. Back at the mansion, the gala wound down. Guests drifted out into the night, cloaked in furs and laughter, their drivers waiting with doors open. But the conversations that followed them into their cars were different than usual. Some spoke of Richard's courage. Others whispered of scandal. A few predicted that tomorrow's headlines would brand him a hero, while others warned he'd be branded a fool. Inside, only a handful remained: family, staff, and Elena. Richard dismissed the last of the waiters and approached Elena, his voice low. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my gratitude. Tonight you were humiliated because of me, and yet you stayed strong. Elena met his gaze, her dark eyes steady, though rimmed with the redness of tears. I stayed strong because of Lila. She believed in me when no one else did. Richard's eyes softened as he looked at his daughter, now dozing lightly against Elena's side. She has her mother's heart, he murmured. For a moment silence hung between them, heavy but not hostile. The walls of wealth and rank seemed to thin. Richard saw not a servant, but a woman of strength, grace and quiet courage. Elena saw not a ruthless billionaire, but a man cracked open by grief and pride, learning too late the cost of arrogance. But even as the fragile threads of trust began to weave between them, shadows crept closer. Andrew returned later that night, slipping into the mansion through a side entrance. He moved like a ghost through the halls, his polished shoes silent against Persian rugs. In his hand was a folder thick with papers, financial records, contracts, hidden debts Richard didn't know existed. Evidence Andrew could twist, if needed, to ruin him. He paused outside the study, where Richard sat alone at the desk, staring at the ivory figurine that had caused the night's chaos. Richard's shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his face drawn. He didn't hear Andrew's footsteps retreat back into the shadows. From upstairs, a sound broke the stillness. Lila's laughter. Elena was reading to her in Spanish, the gentle rhythm of her voice carrying through the halls. Andrew clenched his teeth. The maid's voice filled this house as though she belonged. And his niece, his brother's heir, was being shaped not by him, not by tradition, but by this woman from nowhere. In that moment, Andrew's envy crystallized into resolve. If Elena Martinez remained in this house, she would become more than a servant. She would become family. And if that happened, Richard would never return to the man Andrew needed him to be. Andrew whispered into the dark hall, a promise to himself. Then she must go, no matter what it takes. And so the Hale mansion, once shaken by one public scandal, stood on the brink of a deeper storm, one that would test loyalty, shatter trust, and force choices that no apology could undo. The winter sky over Manhattan was an iron-gray dome, heavy with clouds that threatened another snowfall. The Hale mansion, glittering with Christmas lights strung across its high balconies, stood like a fortress of wealth and history. Yet inside its gilded walls, the foundations of trust and loyalty were crumbling. Richard awoke early that morning, restless from a night of half-sleep and circling thoughts. He stood at the wide bay window of his bedroom, gazing at the city below. The skyscrapers pierced the clouds like spears, and beyond them, the East River reflected faint streaks of light. His mind churned. He had humbled himself before Elena asked forgiveness in front of New York's elite. But was that enough? Could a single night undo years of distance, arrogance, and neglect? He thought of Lila, who had been his fiercest critic and his greatest teacher. Her diary, her words, still echoed in his head. If you can be unfair to Fernanda, maybe one day you'll be unfair to me too. It had pierced him deeper than any investor's criticism ever had. For the first time in decades, Richard Hale, the titan, the mogul, the unshakable, felt small. Downstairs, the mansion was quiet. Elena had risen early too, slipping into the kitchen to prepare Lila's breakfast. Though her uniform had been replaced by simple, clean clothes, jeans, a soft grey sweater, she still moved with the humility of service. Yet something had changed. Staff greeted her with a newfound respect, some even with gratitude. They had seen the courage of an 8-year-old girl, and it had lifted them all. Elena hummed softly as she scrambled eggs, her voice carrying an old Spanish lullaby. Lila, sitting at the counter, swung her legs and laughed when Elena kissed her on the forehead. To an outsider, it might have looked like any morning in an ordinary home. But in the Hale mansion, such ordinary warmth was extraordinary. Andrew watched it all from the doorway. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed tight. He had not slept. Instead, he had spent the night in his study at the club, drafting a plan that would both ruin Elena and fracture Richard's fragile attempt at redemption. "Touching," Andrew said, stepping into the kitchen. His tone carried the weight of condescension. Elena stiffened, the spatula pausing mid-air. Lila turned, frowning. "Uncle Andrew," she said curtly, "you don't usually come here this early." Andrew forced a smile, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. "I wanted to see my niece." "Is that so strange?" Richard entered just then, adjusting his tie, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto his brother. "Andrew, what are you doing here?" "Checking on family," Andrew replied smoothly, straightening his cufflinks. "I hear you've been making bold changes, not just in the company, but in the house." His eyes flicked to Elena, who avoided his gaze. "This isn't your concern," Richard said. His voice cold. "On the contrary," Andrew countered, "everything you do is my concern. You think kneeling to a maid in public makes you noble? Investors are whispering. Clients are calling. You've endangered the Hale legacy." Richard's jaw tightened. "The Hale legacy is not measured in dollars, Andrew. Not anymore." Lila, sitting with arms crossed, piped up with the brutal honesty only a child could wield. Uncle Andrew, you're just jealous because Daddy's finally being kind. The words struck like arrows. Andrew's smile faltered. He straightened and said sharply, "Children should not meddle in matters they don't understand." But Lila stood, her small hands clenched at her sides. "I understand more than you think, and I know Elena is family, even if you don't like it." Andrew's temper flared, but he caught himself. He couldn't afford to lose control in front of Richard. So instead he smiled thinly, almost serpent-like, and excused himself with a promise. "You'll see, brother, this sentimental experiment of yours will cost you more than you can imagine." That same afternoon, the first blow of Andrew's scheme fell. At Hale Enterprises headquarters, news broke of a leaked report, accusations that Elena Martinez had falsified documents to secure employment at the mansion, that she had a criminal past involving theft, that she was an undocumented immigrant using a false name. The report was slick, professional, stamped with logos of investigative firms that Andrew had secretly paid to fabricate evidence. Headlines blazed across digital media within hours. Billionaire Hale defends maid with criminal past. Who is Elena Martinez? The truth behind Hale Mansion's scandal. Richard's phone rang incessantly. Lawyers, board members, investors demanding explanations. By evening, reporters had gathered outside the mansion gates, cameras flashing as soon as cars approached. Inside, Eleanor sat trembling on the living room sofa, holding Lila's hand tightly. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. "It isn't true," she whispered over and over. "I never stole anything. I've worked my whole life, clean, honest work. But who will believe me now?" Richard paced the room, fury burning in his chest. "We'll fight this. I'll call the lawyers. We'll clear your name." But Eleanor shook her head, tears spilling. "Do you know what it feels like to be poor, Richard? To be invisible. One accusation is enough to destroy everything I've built. I don't have your power. I don't have your money. All I have is my daughter. And now even she is being dragged into shame." Lila clung to her. "Elena, don't cry. Daddy will fix it. I'll tell everyone the truth." Richard stopped pacing, his fists clenched. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless, not in the face of markets, but in the face of injustice. Later that night, after Lila had fallen asleep beside Eleanor on the sofa, Richard sat alone in his study. The ivory figurine glowed under the lamplight, mocking him with its false symbolism of legacy. He poured a glass of scotch but didn't drink. He stared at the fire, the flames dancing like whispers of betrayal. A knock came at the door. Andrew entered without waiting for permission. "Convenient timing," Richard growled. Andrew feigned innocence. "I came to offer advice. Cut her loose. Fire her, publicly distance yourself. Let her take the fall, and your reputation will survive. Otherwise, this scandal will drown you both." Richard rose, his heightened fury filling the room. "You did this." Andrew didn't flinch. "Proof? Your fingerprints are all over it," Richard spat. "The timing, the precision, it reeks of you." Andrew's smirk was thin and cruel. "Believe what you want. But think carefully, brother. Are you willing to gamble the empire, your daughter's future, all because of a maid?" Richard's voice thundered, louder than it had in years. "She's not just a maid. She is the woman who saved my daughter's heart when I couldn't. And if you think I'll let you destroy her, you've underestimated me." Andrew leaned close, his whisper icy. "Then prepare to watch everything burn." As Andrew left, Richard sank into the leather chair, his heart pounding. He realized this battle was no longer about class or reputation. It was about survival. Not just for Elena's dignity, but for Lila's trust, for his family's soul. And deep down, Richard knew this storm would not end with words. It would demand sacrifices, revelations, perhaps even betrayals from those closest to him. For outside the mansion, the world sharpened its knives. Reporters, lawyers, rivals, all waiting for the mighty Hale family to devour itself. And within its walls, love and loyalty would be tested against greed and pride in a war that would decide what kind of legacy truly endures.